Hi, Misha here, and here's another long one. Kind of like with the French tanks video from World War I. These are so closely connected and intertwined, I don't know how to split them up. Today we're going to talk about the most famous German tanks and the most mass-produced ones of World War II. And I've got 4 in total, early versions and late. This is the Kfz.141, the Panzer Iii. This is the Kfz.161, Panzer IV. These are both early versions, pre-war and early versions. Over here, we actually have a late Kfz.141 N variant, and then finally a Kfz.161/1, because Germans. This is the kind of the ultimate version of the Panzer IV. Panzer III, Panzer IV, Panzer III. And this really represents how they flipped around. And even though people think of the Tigers, the Panther, these form the backbone, along with other vehicles like the Stug, especially the 3 and 4 versions there. Yeah. So, with that, let's revisit old Heinz Guderian and talk about the German plan to form new Panzer Corps, dating all the way back, really, to right before Hitler's rise to power, and of course lasting through the end of the war in 1945. So get some popcorn, and we'll get into it. We begin with the Panzer IV. Even though, of course, 3 is lower than 4 numbers, this was in service before, and there was a pretty good reason for that. It was a less ambitious tank in some ways, even though it actually proved to be much more successful in many ways. Both, of course, date to Guderian, who you hopefully remember from the first video or just history, and the Waffen-Amt, or what would become the Waffen-Amt's efforts in 1934 to have 2 tanks. Of course, we have the Panzer I and the Panzer II, but they need something bigger, more capable, of course. The Panzer III was going to be the tank fighting, the battle tank. It would go up against enemy armor. It was to be smaller, faster, and to use a smaller diameter, higher velocity, armor-piercing main gun. The second was an infantry support tank, or just in general support tank, following tank. Its job was to work with the infantry, attack infantry of the enemy, go at machine gun nests, go at fortifications, and maybe take out anti-tank guns or whatever else. It was to have a larger bore but a low velocity gun firing high explosive shells, and it was to be a larger craft, slower, but also to have more armor. So these are the 2 that are laid out, and of course all the manufacturers at the time are called upon to submit designs. And at this time, we're still pretending like this is a medium tractor, because in 1934, they're still giving lip service to the Treaty of Versailles. But anywho, we go from there, and and the infantry support tank was supposed to be no greater than 24 tons. So they looked at the designs, and the one from Krupp was selected, and it was first adopted in 1936. But production for the first few years would be very limited. This model here is of the Ost E, which was the second really mass-produced version. The Ost A was in 1936, the Ost B in 1937, and the Ost C was produced between 1938 and the beginning of, or right before, I should say, the beginning of World War II in 1939. The Ost D would go into production right as the war began. The differences are quite minor, all things considered, mainly upgrading the engines and playing around. The earliest versions had very thin armor, only about 15 millimeters even in the front, but this is very quickly upped to 30 millimeter, and then side armor was upped from 15 to 20, and eventually it would go more than that, so on and so forth. And they would have new transmissions. It would actually start off with a top speed of about 30 kilometers per hour, and at its fastest it was over 40 kilometers per hour. And there's some other changes, but you can get the drift, just playing around with the design. The D was one of the first to have up armor, and with the E here, we actually have a second armor plate welded to the front to give a total of 60 millimeters of front armor. But that was an interim solution, and they knew that. Production was actually very low, because this was meant to be a support tank. They figured they would have about one of these for every 3 to 4 of the Panzer IIIs, the battle tank. This was just to be a limited item. In fact, it wasn't officially adopted for widespread use and whatnot until about 3 weeks into the war in Poland. Kind of interesting. So what do we have here? This started off with about a 16-ton weight, but it would quickly climb to 18, 20, and eventually 25 with later versions. The first ones were fitted with the 7.5 centimeter low velocity cannon firing high explosive rounds. It usually carried about 86 on board, so a good number. It had a coaxially mounted MG34 plus a hull mounted MG34 on the right. The only ones that didn't have this were, I think, the Bs and the Cs. The Ds reintroduced it, so some of the earliest ones didn't have it. It used this pretty simple leaf spring suspension. They considered doing a more advanced suspension, but with this tank they wanted something durable and economical. This wasn't a glory tank. It had a crew of 5. You had a driver, front left. You had a radio operator who could also operate the machine gun, front right. But one advance it had that Germany was kind of pioneering was a 3-man turret. At this time, a lot of tanks were still stuck on a 2-man turret. So you had a commander, gunner, and loader up there. And a radio being standard, pretty good too. Of course, it wasn't all roses. They quickly discovered that the armor was not thick enough. The main gun did pretty good at its intended role, and it could punch through about 40 millimeters of armor at about half a kilometer range. So it could take on light armor, just nothing too stout, if that makes sense. It had a few other revisions, like the cupola was changed a bit. There was a bit of rearrangement here and there. And the final version with the 7.5 gun was the Ost F. This replaced the kind of 2-piece sandwiched together front armor with a single piece of 50 millimeter armor. And it upped the side armor a bit more too. And eventually they would actually go to wider tracks. German tanks always kind of had an issue with too narrow tracks. But these were in limited service in Poland. Not a whole lot more were available in 1940. And so while it was present during the invasion of France, it was still not as numerous as the Panzer II or even Panzer I at that time. And it would start to be deployed. After some experiences, they considered that they might want to upgun it. In fact, that decision was made in a conference with Hitler in May of 1941, so just before a certain invasion. They decided, maybe we should maybe we should give it a 5cm main gun. What was nice and easy about that, since this design was meant to be large from the get-go, the turret ring and hull really had plenty of room for expansion. You can kind of see on this model just how small the turret is compared to its, just the gun and turret compared to the chassis and everything. This is just under 20 feet long, by the way, so just under 6 meters. So even though it was a little unintentional, it actually had quite a bit room for expansion. So Krupp was ordered to work with a Rheinmetall design and to submit a prototype with the 5cm gun by November of 1941. Although that would not quite go to plan. But now let's back up and talk about the three. Here we have the Panzer III, the Kfz.141. This is the Ost G variant. So, like I said, the genesis was the same as the 4, but this was to be more of what we might think of as a high technology, or the battle tank, or in British speak at the time, the cruiser. Smaller, lighter, more mobile, higher top speed, and longer barreled, more armor-piercing gun. But they also knew this would take longer to get into service. And kind of the same folks you'd expect, Rheinmetall, MAN, Krupp, and Daimler-Benz were all contracted out. And in 1936, 1937, they looked at various prototypes and early production models, and then in 1937, the Daimler-Benz version was selected for production and further development. But it would still take a little while because they still played around. The Ost A pretty much met all the requirements. They wanted it to be 15 tons, have a max top speed of 35 kilometers, be armed and armored, but pretty lightly, frankly. Kind of an interesting thing. From the very beginning, they wanted to give it a high velocity 5cm gun, but the Army really wanted them to focus on using a 3.7cm gun because that was the standard before World War II. So a compromise was reached where the first versions would have the 3.7, but the turret ring was made large enough that they could later upgun it. So your first ones, really A through even some of the Gs, had the 3.7 fitted from the factory. But then they had to play with the suspension. They worked with various leaf springs and different road wheel configurations. But then they hit upon the torsion bar system. This would be one of the early tanks along with the KV-1 to use it. They also played with the engine a bit. The model, or the Ost E, would introduce the current engine, and actually the top speed would rise up to about 40 kilometers per hour, even though the armor was gradually increasing. It would never be as heavy as on the 4, but we would go from 15mm up to 30. They would add plates, and then they would combine the plates, kind of the same thing that we're seeing here, just up armoring it. This is a little bit shorter than the 4, about 5.5 meters, and the weight started off at 15. It would gradually rise to about 20, even 22 tons towards the end. So still a couple of tons lighter than the 4. Had a radio as standard, crew of 5 as standard. The machine guns are kind of interesting. Some versions actually had 3, 2 in the turret and 1 on the front hull, but a lot of them just had 2. The original 3.7mm gun was not terribly adequate even in 1939, even during the invasion of Poland. So the option to upgun it to 5cm was insisted upon, and you start to see these around Ost F and G in that block and run. By the Ost H version, the 5cm gun is the standard. The 3.7 is completely out. And actually, the Ost J would introduce a long-barreled 5-centimeter gun, something that Hitler himself really wanted. Speaking of, yeah, the Ost, E, and F, really the F. The E was kind of the prototype of it. The F took the suspension, the engine, the transmission from the E, and the F would be the first one to go into mass production. The first ones were just small. And this began in 1938, and the first true production models were ready in April of 1939, just in time for the Führer's birthday. Yippee skippy. Even though the Panzer III was intended to be the backbone of the Panzer Corps and to be kind of the premier German tank, production was slow. Fewer than 100 were available by September of 1939, so Poland, meaning that, yeah, the other armored vehicles would have to fill in the gap, as it were. But of course, numbers would ramp up afterwards. For its day and time, in some ways it was ambitious with some of the technologies, some of the construction. Even though the armor was light, we're using a lot more welding, things like that. Having the three-man turret, that's good. Yeah, but it's a victim of politics, as one would imagine. And these were never really nearly as successful as they, kind of thought they would be, frankly. While they would build these in quite large numbers, over 5,700 to be exact, honestly, production wouldn't last that long. It would cease in 1943. But the Panzer IV, well, it would kind of take over. In fact, the two would end up swapping roles in an interesting little way. So let's flip back over. Now on the spinny thingy, the Panzer IV Ost G. Quite a different version. Like I said, in 1941, they were looking to upgun it to a 5-centimeter main gun. But then the Germans thought it'd be a brilliant idea to invade Russia that June. One problem. For whatever reason, arrogance, lack of good intelligence, they didn't really know the armor strength of the Soviet Union. To be fair, it was kind of a mess after the purges and the Winter War and on and on. So they expected to mostly encounter T-26s, maybe T-28s, which I've done videos on. And at first they did. So the Panzer III with the short 5-centimeter gun was adequate. Even the Panzer IV with the 7.5-centimeter gun was okay at punching through like a T-26. But they started encountering the T-34 and the Kfz.1, and things really changed. It quickly showed that the short 5-centimeter really wasn't enough to penetrate the Kfz.1 and really needed armor-piercing rounds to go through the T-34. And the 7.5 was practically useless. So, they decided, instead of continuing with the idea of putting a 5-centimeter in the 4 in November of 1941, let's upgun it to a 7.5-centimeter Rheinmetall long barrel gun. And so Krupp was ordered to work with that. It took them a little bit to make it fit. They had to change some things because it wasn't meant to fit, but they did. And the earliest prototypes were ready in spring, early summer of 1942. These were first known as the F2, essentially exactly the same as the F1, except the changes needed for the gun. And this was quickly renamed to the G model here, just to make things a little less confusing. And the first ones were sent to Russia that year to try out. and they did much better. They could punch through a T-34 if you close to half a kilometer, maybe 600, 700 meters. And with armor-piercing rounds, they could take on a Kv-1. They're still trying to give better armor protection for the tank because it's still not super great. Kind of interesting, it's on this model. They added a couple of road wheels on the side here, a little stowage place for them. I don't know, it amuses me. The H version added quite a bit of armor, up to 80 millimeters in some areas. Plus it added side skirts, only 5 millimeters thick, but these side skirts were actually good at deflecting or deforming anti-tank rounds, like 14.5 millimeters. And when they would be shot at the treads, the wheels, yeah, it was a good protection. My problem now, the weight's really getting up there, over 25 tons. Even though it does have a new transmission, still mostly working with the same old engine, so the top speed for the H model of the 4 is pretty low. So it's just what it is. You add more armor. I will say that Hitler was one of the driving forces for putting longer and larger guns in all of these. In fact, he was the one that insisted on the longer 5 centimeter for the Panzer III. That was a good move, but he also was obsessed with adding more and more armor, which there was a kind of point of diminishing returns. Nevertheless, 1942 is kind of the turning point. The Panzer III, they looked at giving it even more of a larger gun and just figured that it was kind of at its limit. The Panzer IV, well, it still had a little ways to go. They would actually end up giving it an even longer barrel, 7.5 centimeter gun later on, which would give it even more oomph. Although it did make the whole thing rather front heavy, and that had some issues. So we're starting to see the 3 becoming less important, and the 4 is starting to form the bulk, really the backbone of the fighting force within Russia. A bit ironic, considering that they had barely 200 Panzer IVs in service when they invaded Poland, and even by the time of invading France in May of 1940, they only had about 300. Production was very low, but it was ramped up, at one point being made in 3 factories by 1941, and some morons in the Third Reich actually wanted to cancel Panzer IV production in 1942 since they were confident in the Tiger and the Panther to fill in the gap. Luckily for them, Guderian, backed by Albert Speer, countered this and really not only said, let's keep the Panzer IV in production because it's an evolved design and relatively cost efficient, let's make more of them. And then of course again it led to the model, the H version. It was to the point in 1943 where most on the Eastern Front were the Panzer IV. There were the Panther wasn't quite ready yet, and the Tiger was just very big and expensive. And quite a few Panzer IIIs of different versions were still there too. And of course these were also used in North Africa and other theaters as well. So, yeah. Then we get to the Battle of Kursk, July 1943. And we come to our 4th and final model. This is a Panzer III Ost-In. And this is really when the two just have complete role reversal. Going back to the earlier versions with the higher velocity, at least for that day and time, 5 centimeter gun. Yeah, this was very clearly not able to cut it, and they really could not upgrade it any further. They looked at putting a 7.5 millimeter high velocity gun in it, long barrel. It just wouldn't work. And so they were kind of at a dead end. The long barreled version would go into service first as the J2, then renamed as the L. But the final version that was produced as a battle tank was the M. These were ordered in late 1942, and they ordered 1,000. However, production was curtailed in 1943 with only about 250 M models built. And that was the last of the anti-armor version. Around the same time, though, the N version appeared. And we first saw these in November 1942 when the Nazis just outright occupied Visy, France, and then soon they started to be stationed in Russia. And in actual use of economics, waste not, want not, what the Germans did here was kind of smart. The Panzer IV F1s had the 7.5 centimeter low velocity gun meant for firing high explosive shells. Well, these were pulled off when they went to the F2, the Gs, and so on and so forth, and they had a lot of these short barrel guns in storage. They fitted them to the Panzer III, where there was plenty of room for them and their shells, effectively turning the Panzer III into a close support tank. The Ost-N also had added armor, namely these side skirts. They were also put on the Panzer IV, and the turret skirt. Again, these are meant to deflect anti-tank rounds, not so much stop anything, just, ping them off. The side skirts could be removed if needed. The turret skirts, the added armor, not really. And of course, by this time, this is getting heavier too, which slows its rate. But yeah, it's a close support tank. And this would be the final version that they would build. While they stopped making the M model in relatively early 1943, they would keep making these through the summer of 1943, building nearly 800. Some sources say nearly 700. Take it as you will. So not a tiny final production run. And this model here is actually from Kursk, where they were used alongside older 3s and a large number of 4s. Most of the 4s had the long-barreled high-velocity gun, although some were the older stubs, just whatever they had. They were getting as many pieces of armor together. They had about 2,700 pieces, and of those, the bulk was still Panzer IIIs and IVs, because the Panther was only available in very small numbers, and it was the basically prototypical version. So these had to carry the blunt of the thing. And Kursk, well, that was kind of the final major use of the Panzer III, even this version here. But it was also at the same time when the Panzer IV really proved its worth. So production would be over here, but it would continue for, at one time, the tank relegated to a secondary role. Kind of funny how that works. But yeah, I think this model is quite interesting because of the side armor and the big bulbous turret. Had very narrow tracks though. While the tracks were a little bit widened for the IV, they never really were for the III, so these never did great in the Russian climate. So yeah, let's wrap things up. Lots of things changed in World War II. From the early versions here, you could see the concept that Guderian and the Germans were going for. And in some ways it was a backwards idea. They really weren't thinking armor too much. And them allowing this to have a 3.7 centimeter gun when they knew damn well that they needed something bigger. Yeah, at least the ring was made where they could have it. But these were still in very small numbers when they decided to launch the war, still leaning on the old Panzer IIs and other vehicles. Even for France and the invasion of the Low Countries, they did not have a lot of these. It really wasn't until Operation Barbarossa that the 3 here, the early version, with the 5 centimeter gun, was starting to really form the backbone. Unfortunately, their intelligence was quite poor, so they didn't really know what they're going up against. In the beginning, they could use their radios and better tactics and better morale and better training, but once the Russians started to regroup at the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, 42 was just a year of intense fighting and huge losses. But by 43, Kursk and after, it was just a gradual but relentless push back. And of course, they did evolve their designs, some to great effect. The end model here, of course, was making use of existing guns, and it probably worked better than it had any right to. But the G and whatnots, the problem with the next version, the H here for the Panzer IV, it was very slow. So, in some people's opinion, mine included, the G was kind of the best version, all in all. There was another version put into production in 1944, and that would be built until the end of the war, known as the Panzer IV Ost J. But the only thing it really did was restore some speed and maneuverability. In every other way, it was a decline for the design because of material shortages and Allied bombing and just general falling of quality control at the factory. So the J was pretty crude, frankly. For example, originally this had an electric powered turret, but with the J they went to a manually powered turret. Some of these others would have hydraulics. While they would still keep building these to the end of the war, numbers were very low at the very end. They would, like I said, build about 5,700 Panzer IIIs, and they would build over 8,500 Panzer IVs. That made it the most produced tank that Germany had in World War II, and the second most produced tracked armored vehicle. Somewhat ironically, the first most was the Stug, the 3, which was based on the Panzer III's hull, so a little bit of that there. Of course, the Stug 4 was based on the Panzer IV's hull, so that's how Germany did things. That's not even getting into the Jagdpanzers and Jaegers, and that's a story for several other videos. Of course, these were also used in North Africa, but in smaller numbers, although Rommel deployed them quite effectively in 1942 and even in 1943 in Tunisia. And of course, they were there on D-Day. In fact, about half of the tanks deployed were 3s and 4s. And they were used to occupy nations. They were used in Italy. One kind of fun part, they were used in Finland in 1944 during the Lapland War, when Russia and Finland signed a treaty ending the continuation war. Finland launched an attack against their former allies, the Germans. So there were some Panzer IIIs and 4s sent against them. Ironically, earlier, Finland had been a purchaser of the Panzer IV from the Nazis. In fact, the Panzer IV was the most exported tank the Nazis had in World War II, sending over 300 to allies like Romania. But yeah, after D-Day, they continued to fight and experience heavy losses, Battle of the Bulge, but the majority of Panzer IVs were lost in Russia, nearly 2,500 in 1943, nearly 3,000 in 1944, and on and on. Huge numbers, frankly. Like I said, it was a irresistible tide, and of course, once the T-3485 came around, yeah, it was kind of all over. But even though people think of the Tiger and the Panther, it really was the upgunned the G model here and the H models that were the thing. They did consider putting an even more powerful gun in these, but the long barrel version of this was as much as they could do. Then that was pushing it to its limit. Not bad for something that started off with a low velocity little gun, though. And at this point, it's mounting as much as 80mm front armor. So, maybe not getting all the glory, but it's in a lot of ways the best tank, at least more dependable than a lot of the other fancy designs. And it was certainly more resource conservative than others. But anyway, let me know what you think. Appreciate you tuning in. If you could, please comment below. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.